Good afternoon and welcome to this, the 7th meeting of our Evolution and Psychiatry Special Interest Group. My name is Henry O'Connell and I'm the founding chair of the group, and you can access our previous lectures as a playlist on the YouTube channel of the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland. As always, I would like to thank the college and Helen Murray in particular for facilitating these meetings. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Paul St. John Smith as our guest speaker. Paul trained at Oxford in the 1970s, qualifying in 1979. He trained as a general practitioner from 1980 to 1982, and then joined Hoffman La Roche as a research physician in psychopharmacology in 1982, and investigated a range of psychotropic agents, including various types of antidepressants, hypnotics, anesthetic agents, and the benzodiazepine antagonist. In 1987, Paul returned to study psychiatry full-time. He has worked in a number of London hospitals, including Barnet, Guy's, Greenwich, St. Thomas's, Watford, St. Albans, and Harperbury. Paul recently retired as a community adult psychiatrist, and he is interested in the philosophy of science, evidence-based medicine, and particularly evolutionary psychiatry, utilizing the neo-Darwinian theories of evolution as a way of understanding psychiatric disorders. Paul has contributed to a number of peer-reviewed papers, chapters, and a very important textbook on evolutionary psychiatry, as well as papers on substance misuse, dual diagnosis, psychopharmacology, professionalism, suicide, and depression. He has taught in Hertfordshire, Cambridge, and London universities, as well as presenting to a number of training schemes and acting as an examiner for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And Paul is also the current chair of the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group at the Royal College of Psychiatrists and a founding member of that group. So Paul, you're very welcome, and thank you for coming and agreeing to talk to us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'll just move to the first full slide. I gather most people have an introduction to evolutionary psychiatry, so I won't go through the introductory slides in great depth. So I'm going to skate over those a little bit and go straight on to the meat of the presentation. But I want to make it clear that evolutionary accounts are not a replacement for immediate mechanisms or immediate ideas of psychiatry. They really supplement our ideas, and we don't even have all the answers via evolution, but we have a lot better questions of what we should look for, and we think we add to psychiatry rather than try and replace other theories. So just to quickly look at a schematic diagram of the Tinbergen model, what I mean by adding to current theories is current theories are mainly proximate. They look at immediate causes of things like depression or schizophrenia, and they look at the immediate mechanisms, and that's fine. That's important. And of course, child psychiatry and quite a few researchers look at developmental aspects. But what we do in evolutionary psychiatry is we look at those, but we look at how the current behaviours may or may not impact survival and reproduction, and how they may have done that over a long period of time. So this, in effect, looks at how behavior affects genes because of survival and reproduction. So we look at genes as if it's something, they're things that are there because of behaviors and or what has happened. They're part of the family tree, and we ask why particular alleles, why particular genes are currently have been selected and not others. So evolutionary psychiatry turns sort of genetics on its head. Instead of saying why does a gene cause a behavior, we say something like why do behavior cause certain genes to be selected. But of course that's in a population, not in an individual, because an individual does not evolve. Looking at it in a more simple way, here's the Tinbergen's 4 questions. We look at how does a trait develop during the lifetime of an organism? We look at how does it work, and that's standard psychiatry. But we also look at what is the phylogenetic history of a trait. So that might be through previous human species, or because none of them are currently extant and you can't see behavior in fossils, we have to look across different species. And we also look at whether a given behavior, historically or currently, is adaptive. But don't be mistaken, we don't think that all things are adaptive. And there are very many reasons why things get selected when they're not adaptive. Now that is complicated to explain, but if you think of things like the peacock's tail, the explanation is sexual selection rather than natural selection, or it's adaptive in itself. So what we conclude is that evolution looks at actual reproduction rather than brute survival. Obviously, you've got to survive to be able to reproduce, but there are other things acting here. So we look at how things, including drugs, which is the subject of this talk, have affected fitness over evolutionary timescales. Now, of course, what I've been saying is that if you have a trait that evolves, it can't reduce the overall reproductive success of its carrier. So the question is, how can something which is not particularly good for an individual organism, how can it have a genetic basis, or how can it carry on in the genome if it is detrimental to individuals? And that's partly what this talk is about. So one of the things that we say is things may be exaptations, spandrels or byproducts of other things that are adaptive. So in other words, they piggyback, or that the disease and illness are not adaptive in themselves. I mean, disease and illness can't really be adaptive. So you have to think, right, backaches, that's not adaptive, but walking upright is. Sickle cell anemia is not adaptive of itself, but being heterozygous for the sickle cell gene is useful in malaria environments, and so on and so forth. So we say, you know, why does a disorder persist in human beings if it's detrimental to fecundity? So we divide it up into these different things. The types of illness, or the types of things that occur despite natural selection. So in other words, natural selection is not powerful enough to remove it, or actually because of natural selection. And this includes things which I won't go into details because each one is actually almost a talk in themselves, but you can see balancing selection, antagonistic pleiotropy, where things are, for instance, advantageous when you're young but not when you're old or in a different environment, and things called stabilizing selection, alternating selection, and of course there are obviously things which are functional adaptations, things like anxiety, which may be seen actually as an adaptation in the right circumstances. And so here are here's the list of things which explains why things do not have to be adaptive, but they have been nevertheless selected, or if not selected, have not been selected out. And the most common ones we use are mismatch, which means something is occurring in the wrong environment, life history factors, which means it's something to do with the rapidity of the speed of existence, so that people, for instance, that have been abused or neglected or in adverse circumstances often reproduce earlier and have more children and things like that. But that is a whole talk in itself, talking about life history. And one of my favorites is excessive defense mechanisms. This is where a defense mechanism like vomiting, coughing, anxiety, etc., is actually adaptive, but under certain circumstances is excessive. And of course, the defense mechanism like vomiting can actually be detrimental, and of course one can die from excessive vomiting, so the defense mechanism itself becomes the problem. And I list there the other variety of pathways which may allow the persistence of a disorder. And of course, an actual adaptation which is normal can be useful in an environment, but it can also be not useful in different environments, and or can be excessive or deficient. And of course, there are other options, which is like a trait is brought on or it arises without a precipitant. So the switching mechanism is abnormal, or something completely unrelated to the normal regulatory mechanisms set it off. So that's the general discussion. And if you look at drug use, I mean, I'm going to include all drugs here for all intents and purposes, because a drug isn't good or bad. It's good or bad in a certain circumstance. So some things are naturally just poisonous, like cyanide, but things like alcohol or opiates, in certain circumstances, can be useful. However, things like excessive use or addiction are clearly detrimental to the individual and societies, and can cause a huge amount of problems for psychiatry, because the comorbidity of substance misuse makes treating a patient even more difficult than mental illnesses by themselves. And of course, we need to think about why such behaviours are so common, and how is this persisting in clearly circumstances where they're disadvantageous to health and possibly reproduction. And for something to be evolutionary, we usually reckon that it's a good indication that something may be evolutionary if the whatever you're looking at is found in all human societies. And drug use, and to an extent alcohol, has been found in all societies and in history and prehistory. So it warrants an evolutionary explanation. So we recognize that addiction arises through the interaction of substances with ancient systems designed to promote reward. So in other words, it affects the reward circuits. Now, clearly, the human being has emotions which reward, or at least give some form of message to say that something is going well. When certain behaviors which are adaptive occur, it is evolutionary advantageous for a positive emotion to occur. And drugs tap into this by giving a sign of well-being, or taking away a sign of taking away a feeling of misery or pain. And people have learnt over certainly civilization to use certain drugs, whether it's alcohol or opiates or things like cocaine, stimulants, to modify their emotions. And of course, their emotions change according to which drug you give, and it bears no resemblance to the circumstances in which the person finds themselves. So you can be getting a huge reward despite the world going very, very badly, or you can be in deep trouble with pathology or pain, and you can't feel it because you're taking opiates. So there becomes a disconnect between what the emotions and feelings are for and what is actually happening. So we ask the following questions. Why are humans motivated to repeatedly seek out and consume non-nutritional substances? And I've obviously sort of just mentioned it. But equally interesting is, why do plants contain so many substances which are psychotropic? Because the substances I've been talking about are plant-based, aren't they? Cocaine, opiates, cannabis, tobacco, and of course many substances that we have now, which are chemically produced by drug companies, are based on plant material and form of plant drugs. So heroin is a modified form of an opiate. So why do plants carry things which interfere with the human nervous system? Now, there's a number of different theories which I've mentioned earlier in the general introduction. These are the main theories for the persistence of drug use, and I'll go through them one by one. There's pharmacophagy and infection control, the use of psychotropic medication as sort of pharmacy, mismatch theory, and so on. and I'll go through later on each one. And it's worth noting that there's often a sort of assumption that one theory is going to be the theory. I think sometimes in evolution, sometimes things are selected because of a range of factors, not just one particular factor that accounts for everything. And so these theories are slightly overlapping, but they're not mutually exclusive, and they all may have occurred at different times in the history of humans, and they may interact in unpredictable ways in current humans. I would just say the details of this talk, in much greater detail about this, is in the book that Henry mentioned that Riyad and myself have compiled. And I would advise anyone interested in evolution to have a look at this. It's not because I get a lot of money for it. I'm not just hawking it. It's just really to say, if you're interested in evolution, we've covered most of the areas, not only in drugs and alcohol, but in all the areas that we could during lockdown. And there's 20 chapters on evolution and psychiatry in general. And these are the chapters, but you can see these for yourself. Actually, can I just ask, Helen, would my presentation be given to everybody who wants it, if anybody wants?
Sure, that's no problem at all.
Lovely. So everybody can share this, so I don't have to read out every line. That'd be lovely. So these are the subdivisions of the chapter on drug and alcohol. So to put them all together in an order, there are mismatch-based theories, trade-off-based theories, models based on the various types of selection and signaling behaviours, and there's some other slightly strange byproduct theories. So what we notice in what I've mentioned in the use of drugs is that these are plant-based. And the answer to why plants contain chemicals is they deter parasites or herbivores. And of course, from a plant's perspective, we are a herbivore if we are eating it. And many of them, in order to survive themselves, have synthesized various alkaloids, which, as I mentioned, nicotine, morphine, cocaine, that deter herbivores in general. And of course, humans have eaten things, and if things are very bitter or very hot, we're deterred from eating them. But if they cause a mood change, humans are intelligent enough to work out if things, are totally toxic, or if by taking small amounts they can alter their emotions. But of course, clearly, like drug users today, it's not always clear how much of a drug is in any one plant, and that can be quite dangerous. Humans have, however, developed enzymes for detoxifying plants, and the cytochromes are the system which really shows about 500 million years of evolution, and we've got the same cytochromes, and due to replication, copying of genes, and multiplication of genes, there are many cytochromes for many of the drugs. The one drug that's a slight exception is alcohol, for which we have specific enzymes rather than general detoxification processes. However, going back to the cytochromes, these substances are shown by, if one does a phylogenetic study of the various cytochromes, it's clear that herbivores and the human lineage, right the way through, because our lineage is only about, if you take the separation from our last common ancestor with chimpanzees between 8 and 12 million years ago, there's actually 500 million years of cytochrome evolution. So clearly animals have been exposed to these things for many, many years. And I've got a picture here of a hornworm which eats tobacco plants, and if it takes tobacco on board, it doesn't get parasitized. And the one on the right is on a plant, a genetically modified tobacco plant with no nicotine in it. And as you can see, it's parasitized by a wasp. So one of the explanations for the use of many of these plant toxins, which incidentally interfere with the central nervous system. That's how they're toxic to insects as well as other creatures. And the use of for instance, nicotine as an insecticide or an antihelminthic comes along with an emotional reinforcement of pleasure. So those people, those organisms which were motivated to eat these toxic plants in moderation may have had some survival value because they weren't parasitized by insects or helminths. So the hypothesis, yet to be totally proven, because this is all based on retrospective data, is that under initial conditions, the ability to consume plant substances confers physical advantages, but there also may be cultural advantages, socially taking things which alter mood, and that comes under it, under other theories. So neural circuitry has undergone strong pressure and extensive modification towards behaviours that promote survival and reproduction. That's basic Darwinism. And also primary emotional systems evolved to produce pleasurable affects in response to propitious circumstances or stimuli, indicating adaptive success. And drugs of abuse, as I mentioned before, may be used to diminish aversive, although protective effects, or to increase positive affect, for instance, dopaminergic drugs. And humans with their larger brain may have learned to cultivate in small quantities, or at least recognize plants that would do this. Now, the mismatch and hijack hypotheses are that in the natural environment, in the hunter-gatherer societies, the supplies of these drugs was limited. Now that changes about 10,000–12,000 years ago when there is agriculture, farming. So large amounts of drugs can be produced and excessive amounts can be consumed. And this is where I think probably the problem of regular usage and addiction comes in about 10,000–12,000 years ago. And so contemporary abundance, as well as new delivery models, methods like injecting and smoking, may produce major problems for systems that have not had time to adapt to the increased supplies. So mismatch is also called genome lag. In other words, our genome hasn't caught up with detoxifying these chemicals satisfactorily, even though there's previously been 500 million years to get used to these drugs. The ability of culture to change with human beings is way above that of the natural environment and evolution. So human evolution is too slow to have accommodated the changes. So as I mentioned, the drugs override adaptive functions. So we need an explanation, if we're knocking out adaptations, as why are these genes still around? Is 10,000 years enough to select out people that use drugs? Well, possibly 10,000 years isn't. 100,000 years might be, or 1,000,000 years, but we haven't got that amount of history. And although drug addicts and drug users do die, do they die before they have had children? Now, I think the third bit here is really important. People will still use psychoactive substances because emotional systems become decoupled from environmental success or threat. So people continue to consume drugs despite mounting harm because the drugs, basically, the reactions bypass the evolved protective mechanisms. So they are harmful, but we still have to ask the question, why are these behaviours so common? Why have they not been selected out? And I would suggest there hasn't been enough time, and it's probably not that disadvantageous enough to reduce the fecundity sufficiently in that time frame to be selected out. On the contrary, or conversely, is expected in life history theory that people who have experienced high levels of negative affect or low levels of positive affect to use these plant substances to overcome the aversive biological feedback. And this is for a short-term gain at the risk of long-term harms. And of course, people can be very short-termist, as we know from politicians and solutions. And Hagen and Sullivan have the neurotoxin regulation hypothesis. They say, along with all these theories, there is the idea that actually consuming the neurotoxins in the ancestral environment is useful to cut down whether it's bacterial or insect or helminthic infections or infestations, so that humans have evolved to some degree an ability to tolerate these drugs to a small extent, and that was actually advantageous, and that they could actually maintain blood toxin concentrations to keep them well below a critical level. And of course, people died much earlier in hunter-gatherer societies and in the past. So something like smoking, which might make you feel good and protect against helminths, is great if you do it for 10 or 20 years, but people only lived till they were 40. People didn't smoke for 30, 40 years, and to the extent that we can now do with industrialization of cigarette production. So the pharmacophagy hypothesis, which is the main alternative to just mismatch, is that the medicinal properties of these drugs are part of their evolution, whereas the mismatch says it's about emotional regulation. And I think the two are actually combined together. I think the two are both correct. So they say that the consumption of plant alkaloids contributed to reproductive fitness by reducing infection, etc. So the taste of these substances could have been selected for. Now, I'm just putting down there the effect of these drugs. We recognize most of them, I'm sure, and what they do and the benefit in anti-helminthic and bactericidal, etc., and pain relief terms. So if people want that slide, that's in one of my papers from 2013 as well. With there are many other drugs which interact with, against various infestations. Now, alcohol is slightly different because alcohol is actually something which is used by plants to encourage herbivores to eat things like ripe fruit. So alcohol's a slight exception to the other drugs like cocaine, opiates, or cannabis. So this may be why there's a much longer history of alcohol use, or at least alcohol consumption, because it is partly a nutritional, and it's also partly an assistance by ripe fruit for the fruits to be eaten. And of course, fruits are eaten by herbivores. Plants have been selected to do this so that their seeds are dispersed, whether it's by birds or mammals or whatever. And accordingly, birds and mammals do have the enzymes to metabolize alcohol in modest quantities. And of course, without longer fermentation of large amounts of agriculturally domesticated crops, the amount of alcohol that you can get from ripe fruit is quite small, even though it may be quite attractive, the sweet smell of alcohol and aldehydes. And interestingly, these enzymes are actually present in invertebrates, so insects have them. So obviously these enzymes are very old. So the alcohol has been found in many other societies from way before written records, and it's seen in the Neolithic, and archaeologists have found various pots and things which were used for fermenting grain or fruits. So this has been going on for many thousands of years, but the amount of alcohol was probably quite limited. Now, we were talking about the bactericidal effect of the other drugs, or the antihelminthic or the insecticidal effects, but alcohol may have protected against waterborne pathogens in water. And also you have to remember that things like beers were often done by boiling water, so those people that drank rather unboiled water were at a disadvantage compared with people that drank the beers, etc., prepared by boiling. So it may not have been the alcohol, it may have been boiling the water, but perhaps the two go hand in hand. There are some other theories as well as to why drugs and alcohol are attractive to humans. These are the more sociological ideas. I suppose the main thing is that they're used in some way to increase reproduction, even if the partners are not committed to each other. So one way is the idea that if you drink and show that you're, a big man or grown up, you can drink alcohol, and you can drink alcohol to excess and survive. So that's a sort of signalling that you're strong enough to drink pints or whatever. The other thing that may increase mating, in other words, by decreasing inhibitions. Now, this is reproduction at the expense of health, because obviously being injudicious in mating, there's the risk of venereal disease, or for women becoming pregnant when they're not ready, or it's inappropriate. And it's been explored but not trialed, and this would be a good trial to do, to see whether people with moderate or severe alcohol use have larger numbers of children. There would be one way of testing this hypothesis. Does drinking alcohol increase the number of children in families? One couldn't do a prospective trial. You can't go giving people large amounts of drugs or alcohol to see if they have more children, but one could look at epidemiological data. And alcohol does, after all, increase social context and therefore presumably mating opportunities. And I don't think that is unreasonable, but whether systematically it's advantageous. And the trouble is, we could only measure it now. We'd have to do it anthropologically through hunter-gatherers. But again, one can't introduce alcohol in inappropriate quantities to different communities. That would be unethical. But whether people that drink have more children than people that don't drink would be interesting. Although there's always a problem with this, is because a lot of people that don't drink are reformed alcoholics. So one would have to carefully match these things. And as I say, increased socialization generally. There's a very good book by Robin Dunbar on this, The Importance of Alcohol in Civilization, and I would thoroughly recommend it. So I just mentioned the signaling. So individuals do signal their maturity, and I think we've all known people that have taken up smoking or drinking really to show that they're grown up. But whether this is actually part of an evolutionary process is very debatable. But there are sexual cues that are noted by members of the opposite sex, and presumably smoking and drinking always was one. I think culture changes, and I think certainly smoking would be much less desirable nowadays. And more's the point, people using things like cocaine or opiates would probably be very unattractive. So I don't think, at a guess, they'd be signals which would be valued. So I think there's real problems with the signalling arguments, but certainly the use of alcohol in increasing mating opportunities is worth exploring. And this is consistent with life history theory. My friend, Professor Marco Del Guidice, is very hot on this and has written a number of books. So people with difficult childhoods tend to grow up quicker in one way, and they use alcohol and are more sexually active and have and initiate sexual activity at an earlier age. But whether they bring up more children, especially if they become addicted to alcohol, etc., is very debatable. Again, another epidemiological study that could be looked at. Life history also predicts that men are the most likely group to engage in this. As I say, there's a theory, which I'll go into at the end, about fetal protection as to why women, especially when they're pregnant, don't use drugs and alcohol. And I think we can safely say in these days of political correctness that women are less prone to engage in risk-taking behaviour, although that has changed over the decades. I've noticed more women getting very drunk and more women having alcohol problems throughout my practice. And also, I think what remains is women are, to some degree, although this is modified by the contraceptive pill, they have more to lose from becoming pregnant. So I think it's more risky for women to indulge in these behaviours. And so if there are sex differences, is always important from an evolutionary perspective. And I think we've got a good idea that there are sex differences between drug and alcohol abuse between men and women, and that should lead to certain questions which would be empirically answerable by epidemiology, I would hope. So there's another research project that could be put in motion. Now, what's also interesting, as I mentioned, the fetal protection hypothesis, is that it's noted that pregnant women, especially in the first trimester, find themselves not being able to eat certain foods. And it turns out that many of these foods either have a bitter taste or they become hypersensitive to the effects of plant products. And the hypothesis here is that certainly the hyperemesis gravidum and things like this are extremes of an adaptation for protecting women against poisons, which would include the plants that have things like cocaine, opiates, and nicotine, as well as other nasty alkaloids used to deter herbivores. And of course, many of these drugs are teratogenic or embryotoxic. So unlike my previous hypothesis, which says that there is a reinforcing loop whereby people have either increased high mood or decreased pain or low mood from taking these, in women there is a difference that they, especially when pregnant, may find those drugs have a negative feedback rather than a positive feedback, which occurs in the normal social environment. So the fetal protection hypothesis and the feeling sick in the early days of pregnancy is probably areas to explore with a view to looking at evolutionary hypotheses and reward and so on and so forth with respect to these drugs. And just to sort of cover it again, the disadvantage may demonstrate their strength and fitness rather harder than those people that are naturally able to find mates. So in human situations, you may find people that have been disadvantaged showing off or trying even harder to get potential mates, which puts them at risk, both through straightforward risky behavior, but also by signaling by using drugs and alcohol. And there is consistency in the epidemiology, finding that people that take drugs, it's associated with precocious sexual activity and teenage pregnancy, but that's not quite the same as saying they have more successful children on an evolutionary timescale, because obviously neglect and abuse of children from people that heavily use drugs is a problem. I mentioned other socio-cultural things. Robin Dunbar is especially interested in this, which is the use of drugs in religion, spirituality, and just generally socially. One doesn't have to have a supernatural or a religious background for people to get together. Now, we're a social species, and alcohol acts as a social lubricant. and you couldn't put the same number of chimpanzees together as human beings, because if you had a plane load of chimpanzees, there would be carnage in very short shrift. Mind you, if people drink too much, you get the same thing, of course. So we're not that far removed, especially when disinhibited. But used in moderate amounts, it is certainly a social lubricant. And Robin Dunbar's thesis is that alcohol in particular has been used to the advantage of Homo sapiens, because we're able to, all get a little bit tipsy together and bond together. And it's not actually group selection, but it's cultural group selection. And I think we all know we come from a culture where alcohol is used socially, but of course it's also used in religion. In the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church, alcohol used in the communion, and so there's a long history of drugs in various hunter-gatherers and alcohol in our culture being used in these sorts of rituals. So really, to summarize, because I'm finishing at 2 o'clock, aren't I? So we'll have some questions. There's a series of theories about why evolution hasn't selected out drugs and alcohol as just being dangerous. And I'll just go through them here. There is the mismatch and genome lag theories, where the traditional use of plants is pharmacophagy, and is used for medicinal purposes, but that nowadays there's very large amounts of them which can be used for abuse and addiction. The second one is the drugs changing emotions, negative affect being decreased and positive affect being increased for people that have had problems. So emotional change, but again, because of the quantities, they're used to excess. And importantly here is the drugs leading to emotional systems becoming decoupled, so that actually currently, heavy drug use must be an evolutionary disadvantage, and it's a matter of degree. Again, it'll be like, being very, very fat. Food's good for you, but being very fat, being grossly obese is not. And that because of the actual nature of the drugs, people's ability to see the disadvantage is negated, certainly emotionally, by further consumption of the drug. So if your life is bad due to the side effects of the drug, people take more and more, despite getting jaundiced or having all sorts of problems with the opiates, and of course the problems with addiction. And I haven't actually given evolutionary theories of addiction. That's more complicated. This is substance misuse. Why we become addicted is another question. And of course, the problem with addiction is people increase the amount of drugs they take, irrespective of the threat it poses to them. And then there's the anthropological theories, the social theories, as I mentioned, which is about not just recreational, but other uses of psychotropic drugs with trade-offs. And we're talking here reproduction at the expense of health. So in other words, the disinhibiting effect, the increase in social contacts, etc., allowing extra reproduction, even if it's at the expense of the health of the individual. And related to these is the use of drugs and alcohol in costly signalling and handicap perspectives. That's the Harvey's theories of organisms that do things which are very costly. You have to signal, you have to do something very costly to show that you really mean it. Because we can all say things that are not very costly, and it's not very enticing. But if you actually do something which is quite extraordinary to show how strong you are or how tough you are, that can be quite useful in the animal kingdom. But it has to be an actual strong signal rather than a weak signal. and that can cause all sorts of problems for organisms. So that's a costly signalling in order to reproduce, but at the expense of the individual organism. And there are also a range of rituals which produce placebo effects, which is another talk. And the use of drugs and alcohol in rituals is very important, both in religious but also in general healing. And alcohol and opiates have been used in healing for thousands of years. And the idea of drugs being used in religion, spirituality, and group cohesion, I think, is compelling. So I think there are multiple reasons why drugs and alcohol are used. And there's, as I say, there's at least 6 or 7 different evolutionary hypotheses which may all interact. And there's one I haven't mentioned, which is the modern drugs. This is the drugs which are not directly related to plants, where people have taken the new designer drugs and taken them, and I think that's on the back of the plant drugs. I don't think people would have developed these things if the plant drugs hadn't been there in the first place, but people do use these drugs in a sort of pseudo social way on the internet, and they're called psychonauts. And a friend of mine, Professor Fabrizio Schifano, is the expert on this, and we wrote a paper about how they see themselves as the new shaman or shaman. I'm not entirely taken by this. It's a development of Joe Polemini's idea of shamans among us with schizophrenia, and I'm not totally taken by this, as I think probably people with schizophrenia and psychosis are not at any advantage. So I reckon it's a byproduct of the human nature and the availability of these drugs. And with that, I'll leave it there. There's my summary of the big groups of the different reasons, evolutionary reasons for use of drugs and alcohol.
Thank you, Paul. That was an excellent and very comprehensive overview. And, you know, for anyone who'd like to do some further reading in this, Paul has a number of chapters in Evolutionary Psychiatry, recently published textbook, and in particular in this area. I'll just open it up to see if people have any questions. People could speak out or use the chat. And if not, I might just put a kind of a general question to you, Paul, in relation to drug use in society. There's a debate in many Western countries at the moment about the liberalization of drug laws and access to marijuana in particular. And in this country, we're having a debate. I think as psychiatrists, we're all aware of the dangers, but there is a kind of a movement towards opening up and liberalizing marijuana use. Do you think the evolutionary perspective could add anything to that debate?
It's so complicated. The evolutionary theories are complicated. Drug and alcohol use is complicated. I think looking at the emotional management, we can put it here, clinical applications. I think there are certain things that we can think of, and there's point 2 here on clinical applications. We need to provide drug and alcohol services, because clearly limiting the mismatch hypothesis would suggest if you limit the drugs, people will be all right. So really what's happening at the moment is law enforcement and so on is trying to limit the mismatch between our ability to take them and our, the harm it produces. It's not working. Can anything else work? Well, finding ways in psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy to weaken the cues, I suppose what I would do is we need to look very hard at developmental psychiatry and why people develop mental addiction. It is usually because they're underprivileged and abused, neglected, and so on and so forth. Not always, but very often. So I think we could look at childhood. I think we should look at teenage years where people go into a past life history, start using drugs and having sex and things like that very early, when it seems there's no hope of anything else. They're never going to get jobs, they're never going to live in a nice house, and so they can't afford to do the things that we might do, like go to the opera or something highly sophisticated. So what do? They drink and they have sex. So should we be dealing with those sorts of things? Well, how can one argue against it? So lifestyle there, but also once people are in the system, substituting, the wonderful feeling you have when you have that lovely warm feeling with a modest amount of alcohol. It's very hard for people to actually get that sort of feeling through natural rewards of relationships and success and so on and so forth. And I think we have to help people with that, especially when they've been drug addicts and got that hit of reward from them. And I think you have to help them appreciate natural things, but it's very hard because these drugs may be 100,000, 1,000,000 times stronger emotionally than actual, having love or having actual sex or succeeding in an exam or getting a job or whatever it is that is rewarding in everyday life. And I think it's very, very hard to give a glib answer of just do this and it'll all be all right. In fact, experience shows that many of these things are very hard to achieve, and changing the whole of society and the whole structure of society so people aren't disadvantaged. You and I are never going to manage to do that as psychiatrists. But I think these are the areas that need looking at. It's childhood, it's the social world we have now, the social rewards people have. But I also think it's probably education about, it may make you feel all right, but feeling good is not the same as actually being good or being well or being successful, and trying to deal with it along those lines. And I think that's what AA does try and do. It tries to produce, the social interaction of the group to substitute for the feelings that you get or the person gets through taking these substances. And of course, we now don't need pharmacophagy because we have antibiotics and so on and so forth. So there's no excuse for taking them to keep. Although my father used to smoke heavily and said it kept the mosquitoes away. I think it's very hard because there's a mismatch of quantity and potency. But if we do look into the evolutionary theories, it gives us ideas of what is possible. I mean, it may not be totally successful, but I think the social side is very important, because you and I know that if you just give people naloxone or antabuse, it doesn't stop them drinking. It may stop them drinking once, but they just stop the antabuse or the naloxone if they want to drink.
Yes.
So antagonists don't solve the problem per se.
Okay, thank you. So any other questions or comments?
Yes, sorry, I probably stunned everybody, as it's such an unusual area with so many strange avenues to explore. It's not the usual fare of psychiatry, is it? They're very different routes, and I think that, you can get to Australia from here, from whether it's Ireland or England. You can get to Australia by a number of routes. I think there are a whole range of routes, and I think the evolutionary models say there are a number of routes into drug addiction for the species, and they probably give us more ideas of routes out of it as well as a result. But of course, all routes out of drug use and addiction would have to be tested empirically using evolutionary theory to say, that this predicts that people will get better if you do X, Y, or Z. I don't think is fair, but it gives us questions, ability to do studies, and ideas of what directions to look in.
Okay, thanks, Emer. So, hi, Paul. I'm wondering if you feel there's a role for incorporating any or some of these theories when providing psychoeducation for our patients with addiction problems.
Simple answer, yes. I've spoken to many patients and also their carers and rehabilitation people, staff, and I think new ideas and new ways, because if you notice, none of this was judgmental. This was saying evolution has made people do certain things, which also includes, you know, taking drugs and using alcohol as teenagers, and, you know, reducing misery or increasing pleasure. And it's not blaming the person as having weakness of character or somehow being judgmental. And I've always found both the therapists and the patients want to know more about it and individual pathways. I think I was telling you, Henry, when we met in London, that I was rather shocked when I was giving this talk to who I thought was therapists, and I thought we were going to have nurses and social workers, and they were all Roman Catholic priests and nuns. And to give evolutionary theories to a whole load of priests and nuns, I wondered whether I'm going to run into theological issues. None. They were all really enthused, especially about the social theories. And, you know, I've never, and as I say, the patients feel empowered that it's something that's in their genome, it's something evolutionary that's being tapped into, and it gives them a sort of angle to which to think about how they may deal with these issues. So I think it does have great potential, but different theories, or different parts of these theories have different possibilities in different people.
Thank you, Paul. And we'll just go one final question from Gurjat Brar. Hi, Paul. Great talk, very stimulating. Any perspectives on psychedelic-assisted therapies and how evolutionary psychiatry might inform a more holistic and ultimate approach? There appears to be early positive results for many psychiatric disorders, including addiction, although very early still.
Well, first of all, the psychedelics work. They do have psychedelic effects. So there's no denial of that. What I'm saying in all these talks about substances is when you have a central nervous system, or indeed other effect of a drug, does it benefit the patient immediately? And probably psychedelics don't. If you're in some form of psychosis, it's probably quite dangerous. Depends how much you take, of course, but you are at a disadvantage. You shouldn't be driving or, you know, walking across a road if you're currently under the influence. Does it help people in the midterm? In other words, does it change how they feel about things in the midterm, you know, over days, weeks, months? And are the long-term consequences? And I think it's an empirical question that you have to look at. But things that alter the emotions may do so for positive reasons, you know, that are helpful, getting rid of negative affect, especially when we talk about the smoke detector effect, which I haven't gone into here, which when you have too many false positives of negative emotion, breaking that, whether it's with psychedelics or sometimes with antidepressants or other times with ECT even, can be helpful so that a person can feel all right again and readjust. I'm less convinced by their chronic use. The worrying is the long-term effects. So I think it remains to be seen whether this is useful, but we know with the complexity of human emotion and so on, that sometimes just, you know, it's a bit like I had trouble logging on today. I was a little bit late. Sometimes you have to turn the computer off and start it all up again. And I think these psychedelics don't exactly turn the computer off, but they alter it all so that you can readjust. And I think there will be a group of people for whom it is effective in the mid-term. Long-term is more of a problem. And there will be other people that will just feel terrible and absolutely loathe it. And I would predict that the rule of thirds will occur, that you get a third of people that nothing happens, a third of people that'll respond moderately, and a third of people that will respond quite well. But then you'll get backlash as people develop long-term side effects. And I think this is, I just think this is the natural history of things that interfere with the central nervous system without actually curing the underlying reason they got the problem in the first place.
Okay, so thank you, Paul, and we'll bring the lecture to a close then.